quem nos assiste, então, também as boas-vindas. Gostaria de agradecer o prestígio e também quem nos assistirá depois, afinal de contas, o conteúdo permanece na internet, né? Eu vou destacar que essa sessão será conduzida em inglês, então, a partir de agora, eu vou virar a chave do idioma, né? Porque a nossa palestrante, a Roberta, ela fala a língua inglesa, então, de agora em diante, I'll speak in English. So, I would like to welcome Roberta Comunian. She will talk about developing sustainable creative economies in Africa, the role of creative intermediaries. Roberta is reader in creative economy at the Department for Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's College London, in the United Kingdom. She's interested in cultural policy, cultural and creative work, and creative higher education. She has published extensively on the role of creative and cultural industries in local development. She is also internationally recognized for her work on creative graduates' careers and employment outcomes. She has previously led and coordinated 2 AHRC international research networks, one on the role of higher education in the creative economy from 2012 to 2014, and one on understanding and supporting creative economies in Africa from 2017 to 2020. She's currently involved in the Age 2020 European Union funded project Developing Inclusive and Sustainable Creative Economies and the AHRC funded project Future Festivals South Africa, Possibilities for the Age of COVID-19. Welcome again, Roberta. We are so glad to hear everything about your work and everything you want to say and share with us. Thank you very much. It's with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus, for the lovely introduction. And thank you, obviously, to George and Clarissa for the invitation to talk and to share my research with you here. Thanks. So I'm going to share with you today the outcomes of a funded research project that Marcus mentioned. So this is the higher education funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council here in the UK, and it was looking at developing sustainable creative economies in Africa and understanding the work of creative economies in Africa. The project has just finished, so I can give you an overview on the results of that project, but we also have some developing funding to take the project a little bit farther. So towards the end of the presentation, I will be able to give you also an insight on what we're planning next and what are the next steps of the project. There is a project website where you can find a lot more information and a Twitter account. And at the end, I will also put in the chat the links of the public free policy reports that you can also download from the website. Sorry, I'm trying to move my slides. Oh, I could, here we are, sorry. So the outline of my talk, I'll give you a little bit of an overview about the project, the team that was involved, the scope, the methodology, and the timeline of the data collection. I will focus mainly in this talk about the emerging role of creative intermediaries in Africa. So I will discuss how we define the creative intermediaries and how we unpacked the work that they do. And to do that, I will also present some case studies, those case studies that we collected in our research and are really important to highlight the range of work that creative intermediaries do in relationship to higher education, workforce development, co-working, finance and networks, and also in relation to developing communities. And finally, I will talk about the challenges for intermediaries and obviously draw some conclusions from the project. So in terms of the aims of the research network, when we started the research network, we really wanted to provide a platform for a range of academics, practitioners, policymakers, and people in general interested in the creative sector to interact and reflect on their work and the way their practices was developing in relationship to creative economies in Africa. It was a limited grant in terms of funding, so the actual countries that we engaged with, where we had partners, were Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And we decided to focus on these three countries, which, although obviously focusing on the English-speaking countries of Africa, cover an extensive area in terms of representing both East, West, and South Africa. And the aim was really to bring together a series of stakeholder intermediaries and have a interesting discussion around what the creative economies was in Africa, how it could be studied, but also what was the policy landscape for creative and cultural industries, and how people worked in African creative economies. So before sort of going into more details on the project, I wanted to reflect on our definition. We use throughout the project the term creative economies, as you can see, rather than creative economy. So we are kind of building on some of the UNESCO reflection on the fact that the creative economy is not a single superhighway, but a multitude of different local trajectories found in cities, regions, in developing countries. So we're recognizing there isn't one single definition, and we acknowledge that, thinking that actually it's better to talk about creative economies rather than economy as one single entity. And we push this argument further by suggesting really that there isn't one single creative economy, but a multiplicity of creative economies which can feature overlapping and diverging agendas. So what is the creative economies and what the creative economies are for will be very different for different people and for different countries. So we wanted to acknowledge this diversity. And in fact, and I will go back towards the end of the presentation towards this, we see very much the creative economies as cultural and creative ecosystem. So supporting the work of communities, creatives in delivering opportunities for participation, consumption, and engagement. And this importance of network and ecosystem will be something that will emerge particularly in the work of intermediaries that I will discuss. The other important trend that we wanted to acknowledge within this research is that there has been a sort of a shift in many ways in the way the creative economy over time has been looked at, firstly as being important for community development and society, and then somehow overpowering, maybe towards the 80s, at the beginning of 2000s, much more push towards being an economic sector and limited to being an economic sector. And we kind of obviously want to highlight that possibly after the economic crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008, but you could argue also after the COVID crisis, we see a shift towards looking at the creative economy as being very much a social as well as an economic sector. And the attention to the social and economic, although it has changed over time, we see this as a sort of tipping point, and maybe looking at embracing concepts like creative social economies. So to highlight that the economic driven argument behind these activities is often not there and is actually not often a priority. In terms of the research areas that we wanted to cover with the Nectar, we were interested in the role of higher education, and specifically how university helped the local creative economies. We were interested in the role of policy, in the role of work and co-working, and also in the role of communities, clusters. So there was a lot on our plate as a research agenda. But I think what emerged strongly is a kind of cross-cutting theme, and this is the one of creative intermediaries. So while in this presentation I focus on creative intermediaries, in a sort of way, the same framework of creative intermediaries allow us to touch on all these 4 points on the screen. So it's not a separate point, but it's very much a way creative intermediaries work across all of these elements and ideas and concepts that they are foundational for the creative economies. In terms of the method, I won't bore you too much, but we did a lot of focus groups. So in these 3 cities that we visited, we had an online survey with the participants, people that define themselves as intermediaries. And we got, as you can see, 85 responses to that survey. We visited places in Lagos, Cape Town, and Nairobi, where different aspects of the creative economies were being developed. And we had focus group also with university staff, crafters, fashion designers. So So we kind of wanted to keep the creative intermediaries focus as a main focus to our work, but we also allowed for some of the specificity of different research areas to emerge. And obviously we had also interviews with co-working managers, visual artists, fashion designers, and fashion experts. So we built a big set of data, but in many ways the focus on creative intermediaries allows us to use a range of data, because creative intermediaries were popping up in all sorts of discussion, interviews, and focus groups, so remained a constant theme in our research. And as you can see here, we had this common focus group of intermediaries, but within specific cities, we also allow specificity and connections to specific topics to emerge according to the kind of strength that that city and that context that was presenting. I want to obviously also acknowledge the limitations on our work. Obviously, we are looking at a limited number of countries, English-speaking countries, and of course, this is very much not a choice, not a choice in terms of the fact that if we had more resources and more time, we would have liked to include more countries, and we were trying to think about representing Africa, but of course, Africa is an amazing multicultural puzzle that is completely hard to capture, and that is a limitation that I think any researcher that studies Africa recognize. And it's just that although we're talking about Africa here, it's really impossible to say that this represents Africa in any ways. So that's very much a conscious limitation that we have, and we have to deal with as a researcher. The other limitation is that we did focus mainly on cities and urban areas, obviously because with the limited resources, they were the areas where we could reach and talk with people. But again, not to say that the importance of cities is overstated, and obviously the cities play a very important role as hub to the regions, but obviously rural dynamics in Africa possibly can have other connotation that we are not being able to explore specifically with this research. And finally, this research kind of happened and concluded just before COVID, the COVID crisis emerged. So again, although there is some reflection that we can draw on this, is not we're not able to cover what's happened since then, and that's partially what we would like to do with the next project. So who are creative intermediaries? This is a really important question, because looking at the literature, we sort of obviously highlighted that research on intermediaries within the creative economies has been there for a very long time. You can link back to the idea of intermediaries brought forward by Bourdieu. So it's a long-standing concept, and has always been understood as this bridge between the artist or the cultural producer on one side, and on the other side the consumers. However, we found that more recently is not understood as straightforward as just being this bridge, but others talk about an umbrella term. So creative intermediaries including many more roles. So the co-producer, the gatekeeper, the broker, the agent, the matchmaker, the tastemaker. So a lot of different connotations to the work of these intermediaries. So they just, and within our project specifically, and within the work in Africa, we found that intermediaries are not just bridges, but they are launch pads, scaffolding to cultural production. So we really wanted to unpack more what it is that intermediaries do. So we saw very much a shift, which is hopefully well illustrated by this image. So on one side, the traditional cultural intermediary is a person that filters cultural content, whether that's a record producer, whether there's a gallerist that selects the artists that will reach the audiences. Their concern is very much about the cultural content, what they're going to present to those audiences or those consumers. While for us, creative intermediaries is a very different role. They still do some of that content, they're still interested in the content, but not only interested into the content. Sometimes they come within that kind of chain of connection much more earlier on. They're supporting the artist even before the artist has produced anything, or they are connecting the artist with other people which are not the market, or they are providing resources for the artist so that the artist can create something. So we thought that there is a much more active engagement of these intermediaries within the creative economy in all sorts of places, not just in that bridging role. And we reflected about how this in general connects to possibly a redefinition of the creative sector. So as we know, there has been an expanding of creativity from the more traditional cultural industries, an increased access to culture. So it means there's also a lot more people aspiring to be creatives, maybe than just that there were traditionally. An emphasis on economic growth, so creative industries being not just something cultural, but part of the economy in many ways, so jobs and opportunities that follow up with that. But also in general, the funding and a marketization of culture, that means a lot of people that want to make culture don't have necessarily the resources to do so and needs to find other form of support. So this is a broader landscape of how we see this field changing. And we think that this has got is even stronger, it's got special implication in Africa. And this is because on one side, Africa and the creative economy on Africa has been looked as a key sector for economic development by many international organizations. And also because in Africa, there's been a huge and quick expansion of the digital. So technologies have moved very swiftly, you know, and to the digital world. And also young people are moving directly to digital platform for cultural consumption. So again, there is even more emphasis on the role of these intermediaries. The fact that there isn't a formal cultural policies in many countries, there are informal funding and frameworks, also means the intermediaries can play a more vital role and are maybe more needed even than in other countries. And also obviously the role of informality and networks in the African context, where, I mean, those informality and networks are also the way a lot of people make their living through. These characteristics sort of seems to highlight the intermediaries would play even a bigger role within the context of Africa. So this is the results of our survey, and I'm presenting some of the data first, and then I will go into the more qualitative elements of this data. So this tells us about the kind of intermediaries we spoke with in these three cities. And as you can see, what is quite interesting is that they are all adopting very different business models. And as you can see, all those business models are there in all of the countries. So you can see that in some countries, maybe, for instance, you can see that in Nigeria, the percentage of intermediaries that would classify themselves as a private company, as a business, is higher compared to the one maybe in Cape Town, which see more not-for-profit and charitable organization being present, and the one in Nairobi, again, where the private sector is a bit stronger. So you can see that intermediaries are playing a really important role, but they are adopting very different business models to take that role. Similarly, when we ask what do you do as intermediary, what are the things that you support creatives with, we see that all of them take multiple roles. So there isn't an intermediary that just does one thing. All of them have more than one role. And when we looked at the sum of this role, we found that 53% offer the space and equipment, 75% offer training and skills, 72% offer business advice and guidance, 40% supported with finance, and 71% with networking and partnership opportunity. So we see the range of activities, but the fact that they're all interconnected and they obviously are keen to provide different, not just one, means that again, this is a very interconnected space for provision. If I unpack a little bit more what this intermediation consists of, so space and equipment is quite obvious in many ways, but it's also quite interesting to reflect how in developing context, space and equipment are even more of a premium to create. So not everybody has got the space at home to be able to create. Not everybody's got the IT infrastructure to create. And, you know, in the context like Lagos or South Africa, even power, even having energy, let alone a Wi-Fi and internet, stable internet connection was really, you know, a luxury. So in many ways, the importance of space and equipment is even higher because that enables the opportunity to be developed and the content to be developed. And obviously the creative intermediaries that took on this role really saw themselves as having the possibility to bring together people, the importance of creating a critical mass to mobilize talent. if all together these creatives can get into the building, then invest in the stable internet connection, the stable energy, the stable space and equipment, then creativity can happen. So if they're all dispersed within their own rooms in different places, then that can never happen. So as you can see, space and equipment become very vital to the whole creative process here. The second aspect, as I said, was the one of networking, a partnership. Here again, very similar. Most of the people saw their role as matchmaking, brokering, trying to find opportunities and connecting both to the consumers but also to our creatives. So here is very much the idea that if you create those networks, if you create those opportunities for people to work together, then creativity again will happen. Training and skills was a very interesting one because it kind of insisted on an area where actually there was very little provision in many of the contexts. So on one side, higher education sometimes being a privilege, that not everybody can access. And although people can be creative, they might not be qualified as creatives. And on the other side, the fact that actually those skills and techniques that are often present in practice, in the tradition, in the heritage element of creativity within Africa are not being passed on, they're not being developed and passed on to the young people that could take them forward. So there was a real agenda stretch in the agenda of training and skills, from the specialized business training to the making skills. How do you preserve certain making traditions in the context of Africa? Business guidance and advice was also a key one. A lot of people obviously recognizing that there isn't a lot of knowledge on how to develop certain aspects of their business, whether that's finance, whether it's IP or internationalization. So the importance of specific bodies, specific organization is allowing them to gather that knowledge was perceived as key to the development of this organization. And this wasn't limited necessarily to for-profit organizations. So even small community organizations were benefiting from this business guidance to make sure their IP is protected for the future. So there was really, again, very much a need and of clustering this knowledge and making it available for others to benefit. And similarly, funding was very much of a stumbling block for a lot of reasons, obviously, because there wasn't a high level of public engagement, but also because obviously traditional funders, even private funders like banks, did not have any specific knowledge or understanding of the creative economy and how it worked, and weren't even considering it as an economic sector or a sector that could bring potential. So often finance was just done through family and friends, crowdfunding, and other platform, but actually there was a need for developing a system to which creative process businesses could apply for funding and be supported when needed. So from all this overview, I'm coming to our own definition of creative intermediaries. And I think this definition is very open, but oftenly allows you to understand the kind of organization that we're talking about. So for us, creative intermediaries then became both individuals or organizations that facilitate the growth and development of creative individuals and creative and cultural industries and projects. So as you can see here, the cultural intermediation is not a main focus, is the facilitation of growth and development. They play a vital role in supporting the sector by providing access to information, skill, resources, networks, and this is to enable them to fulfill their own mission. So again, there isn't necessarily a judgment on what their mission is. Sometimes these are creative or business goals. So sometimes this can be staging a play or providing arts education for children. And sometimes it is taking a new product to market. So not necessarily, thinking that this could only happen if it is about taking a product to market. It's much more broad than that. And so in terms of our data, we can clearly see the creative intermediaries come in all forms and sizes, and they can range from a one person, a local freelancer that can maybe have a specialized knowledge that can help others, to a large international organization. So for instance, in our case, we met obviously with organizations like, for instance, the British Council. This is doing a lot of work on supporting creative economies in these countries. So you can see these are completely different organizations, but some of what they do is still still exactly the same job of supporting people to develop those creative ideas. And they can themselves adopt a range of business models. So again, it is important not to be exclusive and reflecting on how the business models also depend on the context in which they work. So some of them can be for profit, some of them can be public sector organizations, charities, some are cooperatives or community of interest companies or informal network. So again, it shouldn't be the business model that they adopt that determines whether they're intermediaries or not, because the business model is very much an instrument towards the supporting of other creatives. So here I'm going through some case studies for you, and these case studies are all presented within the final report of the policy report that is being produced by the project, and I will share the link of the report, which is free to download online. So if you want more details of each of the case studies, you can find it in there. So creative intermediaries in action. And these are 4 areas where we feel creative intermediaries really shined, in the context that we visited. And not to say these are priority areas, but they're really things that we really could observe in those countries where we did our field work. So creative intermediaries for us connect a lot with the role of higher education. And we saw universities in Africa really doing a lot of work to bring that connection. The creative intermediaries really intervene also in relationship to developing creative workforce, and this very much builds on the higher education but takes it even farther. And then the creative intermediaries play a role in co-working, finance and network, and finally they also play a role in communities and developmental agendas. So the first area is higher education. So obviously there is an understanding that higher education plays a role in obviously thinking about how you enter a creative career. So you can obviously think that higher education is really important to provide access to case study practitioners. So higher education is a way in which students get exposed to maybe entrepreneurship opportunities, to develop a profile. However, much of the barrier here are about obviously who gets to access higher education, which is obviously still a challenge, to make that accessible across different cultures, the economic backgrounds. So there are obviously sectors of society that remain underrepresented. So the role of the university is really important to make sure that each communities also get a voice in what the creative economy of a specific country is. But on the other side, we find the creative university plays also a really important role for the kind of research they promoted. So in the 2 case studies we have in the report are one on the Department of Creative Arts at the University of Lagos, and these are some photos of the department, which obviously was visually amazing. And the department does a lot of work to connect with the local creative economies. And one of the things that we really liked was the presence of actual art galleries within the department. And this art gallery was actually established by the staff of the department to make sure that the students not only aspire to work in the arts, but had the opportunity to put on an exhibition, to entertain people in front of artworks, to manage an exhibition, to think about what practical elements are needed to contribute to the local creative economy. So the fact that the university is trying to create those bridges is really important for the careers, obviously, of those students, but also for bringing practitioners and creative industries workers in the university, whether they attended or not university courses. So this is the side of students' engagement. But the other side, another very, very interesting example is the one of the South African Cultural Observatory. This is a consortium of universities. So it brings together different universities in South Africa. And the observatory is actually in charge to collect data, to think about how research can provide input to cultural policy in Africa. So the work they do is really amazing in terms of doing research that is obviously academically relevant and excellent, but also research that can be taken forward by cultural policy or by practitioners to be used in their own work. One of the examples is that they developed a framework and a tool to evaluate the economic impact of festivals, and it's an online tool that small festivals can use to create their own impact report. So the way here at university are working with the sector to really impact the quality of their work and the way knowledge can influence the sector is very, very interesting. The second element, as I said, was the one of training a more broad workforce. So how, in a sort of way, there are pockets where universities can reach, and actually thinking about supporting creative workers further is a role that many bodies and many intermediaries take. So on one side, thinking about potentially recent graduates or people that are starting to work in the sector but haven't got all the skills that they need. And on the other side, thinking about people that have been left behind by university. So people that maybe might come from poorer community, haven't attended university, but can still learn relevant skills that will make them relevant within the creative economy. And here I got two case studies. One is Spear Academy and one is Angel and Muse. So Spear Academy is a very interesting program for people without a degree, so for people coming from maybe a more excluded community from the bigger framework of higher education, which are able to undertake a very specialized training in mosaic making. And within that training, they're both able to learn the mosaic skill, but also how themselves they will become mosaic artisans and creative, so potentially start their own business or provide those services in the future within the broader economy. It's funded by a large private sponsor, but it's a very interesting, again, and different model to think about how the creative economy can be supported and how broader communities can engage with making and being creatives beyond the one that attend the university. Similarly, Angels and Muse is another very interesting project, again, from a philanthropic perspective. This is an actual artist and writer that started it as a hub and for nurturing the local talent in Lagos. And what is really interesting here is that, for instance, they use the income of the space towards running program that support creatives. And one of the programs that they run is about writing for arts. So curators and creative writing that is functional to contemporary arts, which is a niche, obviously, form of training, but which basically highlights that in countries like Lagos, for instance, you could have a lot of visual artists, but nobody trained and specialized enough to provide the writing behind exhibitions and content that is being created. And that is an important element of all that art that might travel internationally. So those missing pieces of training and opportunities are really, really important. The third area is the one around co-working, finance, and network. And here, as I say, again, it's very important to think about how co-working represents an infrastructure. We discussed that in terms of accessing energy and Wi-Fi, but of course, it's a much broader infrastructure in terms of the people you can work with in a co-working environment, but also the kind of opportunity you might find, so in terms of finance, in terms of business development. And here we got to a really interesting case study. One is TribeXX, which is a co-working space in Lagos, and one is EVA, which is an organization in Nairobi that provides specialized finance for creative and cultural industries. So EVA is a really interesting, again, platform which was developed from the creative community in Nairobi to try and break the cycle of finance being very problematic for people who want to start up in the sector. And what they did, they actually lobbied with banks and people in the investment sector to make the creative sector a much more important area of investment for them. And so they facilitate, they broker the bigger finance institution, bigger finance opportunities for a smaller creative industries. And it's a really interesting model that is very original to Kenya. We didn't find anything similar anywhere else in Africa. And the interesting example of TribeXX is also very challenging and very inspiring, because they are a female-only co-working space. So on top of all the challenges that obviously creative space anyhow to create, to have a space, to have an internet connection, gender in the context of Nigeria was perceived as another challenge. You know, female entrepreneurs struggle to rent spaces because they can't really sign contracts because of the way gender is structured in the context of Nigerian law. So these entrepreneurs started these co-working spaces very much with the agenda of supporting women within the creative economy. And so it's really interesting how the gender and development agenda then overlaps with the creative and the business agenda. Now, they come together in one single project here. The last session is the one supporting specifically communities and other development agendas. And here again, we got two interesting case studies, which are more not-for-profit. So thinking about how organization and intermediaries support others to create opportunities. And one of them is a community art space called Gugastebe Art Center, in which actually the creatives have been given spaces and rooms in this community art center to create, but to also make a living, so to sell their art, their work. And obviously this is also about connecting with the local township. So while they also try to run their business, they're also engaging with youth and with others within the community to make sure the township as a strong community. And it was really interesting, for instance, talking with a group of crafters there. They were making craft, but they really were using the funding from their craft to then bring children into the art center to do craft. And their argument was, if they come here and do craft, they won't be in the streets doing drugs. So you can see how the agenda of community overlaps with the creative agenda in a very interesting, connected way. And similarly, another project called Toshika Textile, which was about, again, an entrepreneur starting a social enterprise, thinking about how the local rural community could grow silk bags to be able to produce local Kenyan silk, and how the fact that actually in Kenya there is very little textile manufacturing. So if they could produce textile and inspire fashion artists and creatives to use that textile, they would create a more sustainable creative environment within Kenya textile. So again, a really interesting overlaps between the creative agenda but also the community agenda. So what are the challenges for these intermediaries? Obviously, there are plenty of challenges. I summarize this as policy collaboration and the negative perception towards cultural sector. So in policy terms, everybody highlighted how there is a huge divide between what policy says. They might say the creative industries and creative economy are important, but they're not really necessarily intervening to support them. So sometimes they don't even recognize the sector, but even when they recognize it, they're not really investing in it. And there isn't obviously, again, any cohesion around how policy talks with the sector. But the other bigger question is that even the overall policy arena doesn't see the creative economy or creative careers as viable, sustainable careers. So nobody is putting an emphasis on the importance of supporting this sector. And that is what most people require. They really wanted policy, even if they didn't put the funding in, to be the one supporting and backing the creative economy. In this respect, they all really looked at the role of collaboration, both locally and internationally, as being vital for them to be recognized as intermediaries, for them to be able to work with each other, so to have common agenda and not being separated in different silos, and really working together to then establish a bigger framework through which creatives can grow, but also a dialogue with policy can take place. And finally, as I said, the biggest challenge is this perception of the creative economy as not being valuable. So even the fact that parents wouldn't send students to study this discipline because they didn't see it as an industry that was viable enough was perceived as being really challenging. But similarly, the same challenges were felt towards the banking sector, towards a lot of other sectors that could be vital to support the creative economies, but didn't recognize it enough. And the conclusion there are really two. We see obviously that this research has captured the impetus and the growth agenda that the creative economy has. There is always headlines about how important it is for Africa, and how the example of Nollywood in Nigeria is always put forward as that the economy, the creative economy can lead, can be global, can be making so much revenues for a country. However, apart from those headlines, there is a little investment in how the creative economy works and how it can be supported. And in this respect, we think that from the network, there are two main things that emerge. On one side, how we need to look at intermediaries as part of this creative and cultural ecosystem. And on the other side, the importance of cross-learning and knowledge sharing, both in terms of across policies area, but also in terms of African countries. So in terms of the role of creative intermediaries within this ecology, what we saw is that all of these intermediaries are, kind of intervening where there is a gap, where there is an opportunity, where there is something missing to support the creatives towards the next step. So each of them have got their niche way of supporting them. Each of them should talk to each other to see where, people should go to get the right kind of support. And as I say, if this ecosystem was more visible and supported, then creatives would know where to go. But also, it doesn't necessarily need to be a linear pattern. So at each point, people can come in and get out of this network. But it's really important that the access and where people could get the best form of support is made visible and is connected. And this is what the intermediaries wanted, to be more visible and to be more accessible in that respect. And the other thing, as I said, the importance of cross-learning and knowledge sharing. We've seen that the creative industry policy is obviously connected with cultural development, social development, economic development, but none of these three areas are talking to each other. If everybody's doing policy in distinct ways, and instead they need to be much more interconnected. And that's often what creative intermediaries do. They also connect across these agendas. And as I say, the lack of policy infrastructure also makes so that even if there are amazing examples, like the case study I presented to me are global successful case study, meaning that they are things that are done in a very interesting and engaging way that could be replicated by anybody in the world. But the problem is that knowledge doesn't travel. They often stays very local. So for instance, the case studies I made of EVA intervening in supporting finance for creatives is a model potentially other African countries could replicate, and even other international countries. And we need to create that cross-learning and knowledge sharing platform to allow those best practices to become more of a standard sort of presence in different countries. Just in the last three slides, I've got just a reference to our outputs. So we published 2 edited books in which you can find a lot of the research I've been talking about, and I can, as I said, share the link. And there is a final report where you can find those case studies described in more details that you can download for free, and I will share the link as well. But just a very brief mention, because I know I'm running out of time. We received some extra funding very recently, and we are going to take this project further. And here we are going to focus specifically on higher education, and we have 3 university partners in the same countries working with us, and hopefully developing a local ecosystem within each country in which the university acts as a bonding, as a glue to bring together the intermediaries and the creatives. Thank you very much for your attention.
Roberta, thank you so much for your presentation. Oh, so many insightful contents. And your speech reminded me the UNESCO Creative Cities Network, because it was created because UN believes the impact of creative economy on local sustainable development, and thus it can positively impact local sustainable development goals. So there are many organizations around the world considering this topic. It's so good to know that there are so many interesting initiatives towards those goals in Africa too. So it's very full of inspiration, So I'd like to share a few questions with you. The first one, Honisi Suzuki, who is watching us, she asked, is there a network of collaboration between creative intermediaries?
In Africa, no, at the moment. No, and this is exactly what we would like to help establish with the next project, because as I say, we see a lot of really best practice, really interesting dynamics, really interesting work being developed, but there remains small pockets and people are not talking enough to each other. And I think everybody in the African continent is also very aware of how fragmented they are and how much they depend from north-south connections. So there was also this discussion, even the flights, you can get thousands of flights before COVID to go from Africa to Europe, but the inter-African flights are very few. So again, how do we create more intercontinent connection rather than always looking for best practice somewhere else?
Exactly, exchange is fundamental. So you also mentioned an observatory, and I believe it can be very important for evaluating the impact of all actions, So I bring a question from Isabel Christine. How do you measure impact in the places you have performed your research? Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sorry, can you repeat? The sound went away a second.
Oh, no problem. So Isabel Christine asked how they measure the impact of actions there.
Yeah, so in terms of the South Africa Cultural Observatory, so this is as I said, is an organization that is actually made up by universities and very much in dialogue and supported by policy. And so they work on all sorts of areas. So from events that disseminate academic knowledge so that the creatives or the arts and cultural organization can use it. So obviously they got metrics in terms of the kind of people they engage. But as I said, a lot of what they do has been also webinars during COVID. So again, they try to, as much as possible, facilitate the sector coming together and sharing knowledge. And as well, they try to bring the academic expertise. But also, it is really important because I think the dialogue in many countries, this is not just in South Africa, the dialogue between university research on one side and what the sector needs is often very broken. Yeah, so universities will research on something, but they never communicate that with the people who need it. Or people in the sector really need some sort of research and some support on something, but they never have any channel to tell academics or universities is really what we need now. And finding that intermediary organization that can do that, that's the key in a sort of way to unlock a lot of that knowledge sharing.
Yes, it's a very important topic because we talk a lot about ecosystems, communities, and communication always plays a fundamental role, right? So all actions can be added from one side to another, and instead of doing the research or the work alone, you can, of course, do it in a broader network. So, in talking about other actors in that context, what was the level of participation of municipal level governments that you found during your research? Of course, in terms of fostering creative economy, have you found some relevant public policies as examples or something like that?
I think there is. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think different cities have got very different views on how they promote themselves. And I think, like, for instance, I can make the comparison, I would say, with Lagos and Cape Town. That's quite interesting because on one side, Cape Town is has been promoted as a creative city. It's been a city for design. It's been, kind of is very much before COVID, of course, on the tourist map, on the destination map. So you can clearly see that the investment towards promoting the town is there from a policy perspective. That doesn't necessarily translate in supporting the creatives. And that's the kind of, I think, the problematic thing is that sometimes the public policy associate investment in tourism and branding as being the one that support creatives. But that link is there, is feeble, but it's not always, that necessarily straightforward. So it might be that you bring tourists in that don't necessarily want to buy the local stuff. They might want to buy other things. So we need to, to make sure that link is strengthened if they think that promoting the image equals as for promoting creative industries. So Cape Town, though, has been really interesting because they did a lot of that waterfront regeneration, but within that there is a lot of also designers that are present with little spaces. There's like a huge designer shed where designers designers can sell their stuff that is made, locally. So there is actions, I think, that are really important to support creatives from a city perspective. But there is other cities like Lagos, which I think hasn't done as much as it could, considering that, for instance, it's the capital of Nollywood and is, potentially is a very creative city. Yes. It doesn't have at all that international image that, for instance, Cape Town has. But that's just a missed policy opportunity, I think, and that's possibly because the policy in Lagos seems to be very much laissez-faire, so let the creatives, businesses do their business. So like on Hollywood, doesn't receive any public support. They do it and they do it themselves. But the way this could have had a much bigger impact if other opportunities were implemented for city branding and other things, that seems to be a missed opportunity there.
Yes, it's a real challenge, definitely. And there's so many other things to do. It's just starting, So, Roberta, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us. Thank you so much. And I would like to highlight that this event is held by Federal University of the State of Santa Catarina, UFSC, and the Knowledge Management Engineering Department, EGC, via Estação Conhecimento, Urbs Nova, and Distrito C. Roberta, thank you again. I'll leave you the final words with you.
Thank you very much for your attention, and get in touch if there is anything that I said that you would like more information on.
We'll definitely stay. Yes, take care, you too. We will definitely stay in touch. I'm so glad to learn from you, and people, everyone who are watching us right now. Well, keep following our work on social media. Our next panel starts in a few minutes, so people stay tuned. We'll be back on the same link very, very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Maravilha, Marcos. Muito obrigada.
Bye-bye,
Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you very much, Roberta.
Bye-bye.